I'm Cierra Bettens. This is APTN News InFocus. On this episode, on the ground at Operation Nanook.
100 kilometers west of Yellowknife, soldiers are securing the Edzo airfield from possible enemy saboteurs. Thankfully, it's a mock scenario, one of many training exercises in Operation Nanook-Nunalivut. Signal operator Nigel Gates' job is command and control. Using VHF radio, he makes sure everyone's aware of what's going on at all times.
One of the challenges is always just going to be equipment in the cold. Like some of our wires are just frozen solid, so you always have to bring spares to ensure that you can maintain communications while out in the field, because you're expected to provide communications 24/7 with HQ, with the soldiers, so everyone stays connected and situational awareness.
That was a clip from a two-part report on Operation Nanook by APTN's Charlotte Morrit-Jacobs. Every winter, the Canadian Armed Forces runs Operation Nanook, a military training exercise that promotes the country's Arctic defense capabilities. This year's operation was the largest to date, with up to 1,300 members deployed across Yukon, the Northwest Territories and Nunavut, alongside allies from the United States, Belgium, France, and Denmark. The annual operation has been running for nearly 20 years now, but with rising geopolitical tensions, it's taken on a new meaning. Charlotte had the opportunity to visit the training camp in Edzo, located about 100 kilometers west of Yellowknife, and she joins me now from the Northwest Territories to share what she saw. Charlotte, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we all know that today's geopolitical climate has changed and intensified. I'm wondering, how did that play into this year's Operation Nanook?
Yeah, so Operation Nanook has definitely evolved into kind of a near persistent, almost year-round sort of training operation, with the Arctic component happening every year annually, kind of February, March. It's been around since 2007, but the amount of troops on the ground and the scope of allied nations, international partnerships really is kind of lining up with their mission to better protect Canada's sovereignty against, like you say, growing geopolitical. I guess the word that was used actually in one of the briefings was chaos and a climate that is unpredictable, like having to pivot, having to respond faster, having to mobilize. And Operation Nanook's size, as they increase every year, is really showing that they're able to operate, with security in mind when ice leaves sooner and freeze up happens a little bit later in areas where there is limited infrastructure. This year they really chose different locations with a focus on figuring out where they could put infrastructure if needed to have command and control, to have communications year round. And that really showed, I guess, more of a whole government approach. Even the dignitaries, when I went up this year, it seemed like there was more dignitaries going than years past.
Yet I'm wondering, were you traveling on the military flights with the troops?
Yeah, so they did offer media the opportunity to either embed in their longer patrols, whether that was, a full 10-day operation or even 2 weeks, probably not the full 2 months, but they really allowed media to pick and choose. I was able to go to Edzo, which is about 100 kilometers west of Yellowknife, with Grizzly Task Force, which was primarily troops from Edmonton and Alberta up here for exercises in securing critical infrastructure, such as our hydro station in Yellowknife, and then the Edzo airfield, while it was still in operation for everyday civilians. So I was able to see, and this was just by road driving with military, when they secured their surveillance around those pieces of critical infrastructure, which included checkpoints and patrols via snowshoe, skis, skidoos, helicopters. And then going up for Cambridge Bay, I flew up with military, and with that exercise, it was another one where they brought up dignitaries, and it was to test out specific military artillery equipment, including for the first time ever bringing in the M777 howitzer, which is one of the massive military guns. It was the first time it had ever actually crossed the 60th parallel, coming up from Shiloh, Manitoba, up through Edmonton, and then watching it be ported onto an airplane, which took about 12 personnel just to load up this huge howitzer, and then bringing it out to the firing range outside of Cambridge Bay in the tundra and seeing if they could fire it. So those were the opportunities I was able to go to. However, there's so much more that goes into this specific 2-month exercise, including cold water diving, where they practice exercises to see if they'd be able to locate lost equipment or rescue operations of personnel. There's also, I believe, aircraft exercises as well. So really showing their capabilities for, I guess, land, air, cyber, maritime, and space.
Yeah, it seems really interesting. A lot of the military personnel, they're not from the Arctic. I'm wondering, how did they respond to some of the extreme temperatures? And, what was the weather like when these exercises were going on?
Yeah, it was, I would say everyone had a really good attitude when they're going up to the subarctic and the Arctic. I don't think anyone was thrown into the mix without cold weather Arctic survival training as a baseline. However, Lieutenant Colonel Bryn Wright, commanding officer of Grizzly Task Force in Edzo, when I was out there with troops, the way he described it to me was training troops to crawl, then walk, and then run. So building their capabilities really by learning from Canadian Rangers, a huge force across all 3 territories of traditional knowledge and land-based practices. Everything from folks realizing, okay, if I'm stationary, say I'm at the checkpoint in Edzo, I need to be scrunching my toes, scrunching my hands. I need to ensure that I'm not running through snow because, if you do sweat and you catch a chill, you're at risk for hypothermia. Speaking with some of the signal officers, they knew it was cold, but they didn't realize just how cold it would be for communication gear, for drones, how fast they would need to work, and the contingency plans that would have to be in place. But I had one individual who was, I think, only 18, and he had just slept outside in -50 the night before and was going to do so the consecutive days. And he was most excited to bring these skills back to Treaty 6 and 7, where he's from, and share what he learned as, he was, I believe, a private, and share that with his community. So that was really cool to see. It was awesome to know that they were learning from Canadian Rangers who were with them in every operation about how to survive up here, because it's not easy.
Could you actually speak a bit more about, what role land-based knowledge plays in Arctic military training? Because I know that was mentioned a bit in your article.
Yeah, so I didn't actually get to go out with the Canadian Rangers this time. However, they are such a presence across 61 communities across the Northwest Territories, Nunavut, and Yukon. Canadian Rangers, there's approximately about 1,500. And with that, they've been around since the end of the Second World War and started up their own programs to basically be the eyes and ears of the North, to relay any information of suspicious activity, unfamiliar activity, changes to the land. And they report, although they're not full-blown reservists and don't necessarily have to do the same basic training, they are embedded with Joint Task Force North, which is the headquarters for the CAF, the Canadian Armed Forces, I guess, reservist group. So the Canadian Rangers go out on routine patrols. They routinely, throughout the years and throughout the months, conduct exercises to be able to help when needed for things like missing persons in the Northwest Territories. They help out when there are situations like flooding, like wildfires, and report especially with climate changes on the land that could impact military operations.
And so while at Edzo, you spoke with Nigel House and Weaselhead Kwewin, two Indigenous members of the task force Grizzly. I'm going to play a clip that we heard from them.
Pockets, hand warmers.
Nigel House and Weaselhead Kwewin have been friends since basic training and can add canvas tent camping in -50 and patrolling in the bush with skis, snowshoes, and snowmobiles to their skill sets, learning from other Indigenous members like the local Canadian Rangers.
Basically, we call it snowcrete, just basically just snow, piled on top of snow, more snow, water. If possible, to get some gravel, if possible, mix that in a bit. Same thing, just layer, compress, water, snow, compress, and then you'll have your little makeshift defensive position.
What did you hear from Nigel and Weaselhead about their experiences and what sort of motivated them to do this work?
You know, everyone I spoke to who was, say, under the age of 25 just saw the benefits of the military being able to blend traditional lifestyle of being outside on the land with discipline, and saw their service in the Canadian Armed Forces as opportunities to further education as well. Both of those young men said that they've been able to learn and travel across Canada in ways that they might not have otherwise been able to. And that they just had this profound sense of pride in what they did and who they were learning from. Yeah, I will say there was, there's an obvious gender divide, though. I did speak with one surgeon in part of the medic team up in Cambridge Bay. However, I was on the hunt to speak with any female soldiers at any level, and there still was that unfortunate gender divide there, so I wasn't able to speak to as many as I would like to. But from my understanding, with expansion of Joint Task Force North, with the investment in Operation Nanook and other Arctic military training exercises, there's going to be more recruitment efforts, whether that's to bring in more Canadian Rangers, because there are, when you get into the Canadian Rangers, there is a greater representation of Indigenous women across the North for that, not necessarily fully embedded with Canadian Armed Forces, but Yellowknife's expansion of Joint Task Force North is going to see, from what I've heard, a new recruitment center. I don't know if that means a new department or just a new strategy to hopefully attract more women and gender diverse folks.
Mm-hmm. So reading your story back, you write, quote, "In the Arctic, sovereignty is not just about flags and force. It's about survival on the land, in the cold, and in relationship with the people who have always called it home." And I'm wondering, can you speak a bit more to the role that relationships play in Arctic sovereignty?
Yeah, so one thing that I would say in the Northwest Territories, I think the biggest relationship the Canadian Armed Forces has that doesn't necessarily translate down south is that Canadian Rangers point. There's not quite the same historical relationship with the Canadian military in the North because the Rangers have been around so long. And frankly, there's more Canadian Rangers, around like 1,500, than there are members of Joint Task Force North and the Air Base Squadron and even Canadian Coast Guard. There's far more Canadian Rangers. From my understanding, every operation that they do in the Arctic, they always seek permission from Indigenous leaders of that traditional territory. I saw as operations were taking place in Treaty 8, Treaty 11, Klitschko government, they had officials out there, leaders and elders congratulating the work that was being done. And same with Inukjuit territory, Yellowknife's Dene, as onlookers, but also having members of Canadian Rangers that were actually part of those training exercises. Speaking with the lieutenant commander of Joint Task Force North with increased operations. I did ask on efforts of reconciliation, and he told me squarely that every year there is a bigger meeting with Indigenous governments around what training exercises and operations will take place. And the headquarters in Yellowknife does send out, I think he said, over 200 letters of interest in speaking with each level of Indigenous government and Indigenous groups. The partnerships are critical, especially going into places that are remote and have limited resources. I saw in Cambay, for example, the military medic team was able to surpass the local healthcare facility in their capabilities. And it was explained to me that whenever Canadian military goes into these communities, their objective is not to deplete the resources of, already finite services. Cambridge Bay does not have access to a ventilator. They cannot do blood transfusions. Before even going up to the community, the medic team was meeting with local Inuit leadership on what sort of services they would like to see from the military in their time there. I was informed by Major Stephanie Smith, the surgeon of that medic team, that they would be conducting CPR classes and infant choking hazardous courses, because those were things that the community wanted as well. It was explained to me that they were meeting with elders to find out best practices for treating civilians and treating even locals who are embedded with the service, such as the Canadian Rangers. And the importance of that is if the military is going to be responding to situations that are rapidly evolving and local services cannot get to civilians, and it's really the military that would be responding. It's important that they're able to provide services in a culturally safe way, that understands the historical mistreatments, traumas, and mistrust of Western-based healthcare practices. And, that also bleeds over to other institutions, not just medical care. Yeah, I really think it's meeting ahead of time and while they're there with local leadership on how best to serve the communities, how things operate, what their challenges are. Even up in Cambridge Bay during a tour of the Canadian High Arctic Research Station, who predominantly serve the interests of Inuit-led research on things like food security, climate change, healthcare. It was explained to the Canadian Armed Forces that the most robust piece of infrastructure that this world-class facility had was the fact they had this big heated garage. Nothing necessarily fancy, but those are the types of remote communities that if the military, as they increase their defense budget, is going to be investing in these remote, primarily Indigenous communities, they need partnerships, and they need buy-ins, and they need to hear what the local populations really need from so they can benefit from building infrastructure in the communities that can be multi-purpose and serve the community and the military.
Mm-hmm. And, based on what you've heard from community members and local populations, is there a sense from them that they feel these relationships are mutually beneficial?
Yes, I would say from folks that are with the Canadian Rangers, the access to training opportunities. I've never been to a community where I haven't met a Canadian Ranger. Everyone knows a Canadian Ranger because they're so prevalent across the North. So from a training standpoint, yes. But when we get into the discussion around Arctic sovereignty, I think it's still up for debate. And, it's a word that's really thrown around a lot in the last few months. And being in Cambridge Bay, I did, I was reminded, not explicitly during the visit, but just from discussions with with other folks I know from the Kitikmeot region afterwards that, there is already sovereignty that's built into the Nunavut Land Claims Agreement, sovereignty over water that's supported by Inuit use and occupancy, that's been since time immemorial. And if that were to dissolve and Inuit say withdrew that support, Canada would not have claim to the Northwest Passage. They wouldn't have that historic title over the 70% that is Canada's coastline that's in the Arctic. That is on traditionally lands and waters of Inuit. So as much as there's been more support for Arctic sovereignty through Canadian military, that sovereignty exists because of the fact that it's on traditional territory of Indigenous people.
And so you also spoke with a scientist from the Canadian High Arctic Research Station, and I'm wondering, what role is scientific research playing in, this notion of securing Arctic sovereignty?
Well, I think when you look at science and in the Arctic specifically, the rate of climate change being far more rapid than other parts of Canada, places such as the Canadian High Arctic Research Station predominantly look at extreme events of knowing how to better detect and predict and respond and mitigate to the effects of climate change, which is important to the Canadian Armed Forces mandate to, detect, deter, and defend if necessary, that Arctic coastline and Arctic land. And, we've seen the military have to step in, even right in Yellowknife with the 2023 evacuations from wildfires and responses to floods in the southern portions of the Northwest Territories and even northern Alberta, Yukon, and they're happening more frequently. The idea of expanding and prioritizing scientific research in the Arctic is that it could benefit and complement the work that Northern Indigenous groups are already doing through government, through not-for-profit groups, through research bodies, that includes traditional knowledge, Inuit knowledge, the work that they're already doing, but then matching that dollar sign to them. I guess another part of sovereignty, we often think about land defense, but it's also serving and being able to sustain the folks who live there year round, not the folks that are coming in with the Canadian military, for these training exercises, although they are increasing more and more. But it includes things like the ability for folks to traditionally harvest. That's an important part of self-sustainment. It's an important staple to the economy, to the culture, and to anyone who lives in the Arctic. So a large part of scientific work is around monitoring and surveillance of wildlife health and having partnerships and research with communities, with harvesters, with local hunters and trappers organizations. And that's some really interesting work that is being done at facilities such as CHARS. Another focus on research as it pertains to Arctic sovereignty is the focus of energy technology and our very, very, very heavy reliance on outdated technology such as diesel energy that is contributing to climate change. And the support to better integrate clean energy, renewable energy options to get off of that large dependence on diesel for electricity and heat and transportation. In Nunavut, I believe the consumption of diesel is actually the highest in the country. It's over like 1,000 liters per capita, which is shocking. It's also very, very expensive. The cost of living because of this dependence is absolutely shocking. I know Northwest Territories and Nunavut pay the highest for electricity costs, often for heating costs. So that's another huge component to being sovereign and self-sustaining.
So, from your perspective on the ground as a reporter, what was the overall sentiment about Canada's preparedness to defend the Arctic?
I think my overall sentiment from the days that I was embedded with the military was they were able to achieve their mission as far as securing critical infrastructure and bringing artillery and military equipment into the Arctic and testing it. But there still remains a lot of challenges. I wasn't able to actually see the M777 howitzer fire because of weather. It wasn't that they were necessarily unable to fire. They had everything set up. Everyone's waiting around. But with changing weather, the nearby airport actually had planes being deferred in and out of Cambridge Bay, so they weren't able to fire. And that, is a learning experience, the way that Steve Boisvois, who is the overall commanding officer of CAF, he explained it to me that it's not a rehearsal, it's a demonstration. And to conduct these demonstrations, they have to conduct their training exercises well. Everyday people go about their business, and they have to work with communities alongside of them as regular life goes on. I think some of the key takeaways is that, of course, it's going to be logistically demanding to bring up, I believe, 1,300 troops overall for Operation Nanook. To get all of those troops up to the Arctic for that long is an incredible feat. And there's obviously significant environmental challenges as well that we've already discussed. But it really shows that they like scaling up their operations, that I don't really see them downscaling what they're doing. I believe in over the summer, they're going to be conducting in the eastern part of Canada, in eastern Quebec, one of their biggest components of Operation Nanook, which is actually broken down into 7 operational components to make it that almost year-round component. So the one that I was able to go to in the Northwest Territories is Nanook-Nunalivut, and that's the winter operations. But the Kasivimivik, that's the one that will be their larger scale upcoming exercise, and that will see around 4,000 troops, if I'm not mistaken, which to date that would be the biggest ever component of Operation Nanook since its inception in 2007. So I would say they're training up, they're doing a good job to use this training to respond to things like natural disasters in at least as we've discussed in the Northwest Territories and elsewhere more and more.
So, Charlotte, my last question for you. The military says next year's Operation Nanook is going to be even bigger. Can we expect more stories from you?
Yes, absolutely. And before the inaugural winter component of Operation Nanook, there'll be several updates with the construction of a new defense base outside of Yellowknife, just on the outskirts, for the Canadian Rangers, which broke ground in April 2024. And that will better equip their first squadron, as well as the expansion of Joint Task Force North, where money was invested to expand their personnel almost twofold from around, I believe, over 120 staff there full-time to 300. With that, the federal government's new defense budget also announced very recently over 30 new units for military in Yellowknife alone, which is huge considering we have a housing shortage. And they recently named the 3 northern hubs that will be used for infrastructure upgrades. Those hubs being Yellowknife, Inuvik, and Iqaluit. And it's over 15 billion for the expansion of runways, new aircraft, and their, I guess, improvement of Canada's ability to conduct operations from the north, from those new hubs. Those are places like Iqaluit and Inuvik does have aging infrastructure. They're very small. So that's super, super exciting. So well before this time next year, there will be opportunities for stories that I'll be following.
Awesome. Well, looking forward to those stories. And yeah, thanks so much for joining us, Charlotte.
Thank you so much.
Charlotte Morrit-Jacobs is APTN's video journalist in the Northwest Territories. You can watch her two-part story on Operation Nanook at aptnnews.ca. This episode was produced by Mark Blackburn and edited by Jesse Andrushko. Charmaine Straker is the executive producer of APTN News InFocus. We want to know if you're enjoying the show. Please leave a rating and review on your favorite player or email suggestions to infocus@aptn.ca. Also, give us a follow. It helps other people find the show. I'm Cierra Bettens. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next week.
APTN presents a captivating journey into the heart of the North with our latest podcast, The Place That Thaws.
Some areas that used to be safe are no longer safe.
Hosted by me, Danielle Parody. Join us as we uncover the intricacies of life on a changing coast. Subscribe and listen to The Place That Thaws.